Hi, I'm Selena and welcome back to my channel. So last time I talked to you about some books that I'm intimidated by, and a lot of that had to do with content or size or the reputation of the series or the book or whatever. And this time I'm going to focus on one part of those and talk to you about some of the books that are very large that I've loved. So if you're looking for your newest tome recommendations video, this is it. These are not super unpopular picks, but I'm sure you'll maybe find a couple in here you haven't read, or you'll be further encouraged to pick up some books that you have heard about but haven't gotten to yet. Just to clarify before we get started, the things I am classifying as like a big book is basically 500 plus pages. If something's right around 500 pages, it counts, but most of these skew far above 500 pages. And so, yeah, and these are just my favorites, or some of my favorites that I've read so far. So starting off this video with one that I've read really recently, I'm gonna talk to you about Jade City by Fonda Lee. I'm pretty sure this book is just over 500 pages or something, and then the sequel is about the same size, or maybe even longer. And so these are definitely the shortest books on the big book list. And so I definitely still recommend them because they are 500 pages, but I especially think this could be a good book for someone who is intimidated by long, extensive books, because really Jade City, the first book, I'm reading the second book now, so I can't really recommend it yet, but the first book was amazing. And that one in particular is very much a contained story in a contained city with a very fleshed out culture, with very readable, realistic characters that are all so interesting, and a really fast-paced, fun plot. I will say some people say the beginning of Jade City is slow. I didn't feel that way. I thought it was amazing. This is basically like a gang wars story. There's multiple gangs that run the country of Kaigen and the city of Junloon, and we follow some of the higher ranking members of one of the clans, and their family is like in the highest positions of the clan, basically. And a clan war is brewing. And so this is a very political action-y book, because really these gangs are political figures, but it's not a slow diplomatic kind of politics. This is dirty, quick, we'll settle this on the street type of politics. And so this is a really fast and interestingly plotted book. I think that it has its slow moments, probably from what people say, but I thought it was interesting the whole way through, and it was such a gripping plot with gripping characters, an amazing magic system that was really, really cool. And I just think that a lot of people could like it. It's not as thick as some of these books, but it's still over 500 pages. Moving on to my next big book recommendation, and that is The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. So this is a book that I read at the beginning of the year and loved. It's my favorite book of the year so far, absolutely, hands down. And it's about a small town that's very traditional in this larger empire. This particular town is based off of like older Japanese culture, like samurai culture, I believe. And so you follow this warrior town that is basically tasked to protect the empire that it is a part of. And war comes to this town, but this is really a character story. We're watching as conflict comes to this town through the eyes of two characters, a mother and a son. And you really are watching as their roles as people shift, their roles within the family shift, and their roles in society shift, and what that does to them. And it's so good. This book is so emotional, so amazing. I've seen people dislike parts of this book because the beginning and the end can be a little slow or info dumpy, or they can feel very tonally different from the middle of the book. But I personally loved this whole book. I thought it was amazing. I loved every second of reading this book. This was like 600 book pages, and I had so much fun just going through it. It's not a fun book, it's a heartbreaking book, but it's such a gripping, fantastic read. And I read it so quickly that it felt much shorter than it is to me. My next recommendation is anything by Brandon Sanderson. Pretty much there's only a couple of books that he writes that are short. Most of his other books are above 500 pages. My favorite is the Mistborn Trilogy, which is these blue books right here, or I'll put a picture here. Mistborn. This is a trilogy. It has a more contained setting of one world, one country, and it's about what happens if the Dark Lord had won, what would happen if a group of rebels tried to lead a heist to depose the Lord Ruler. It's got a really interesting plot and it moves fast at times, but I would say that overall these books are kind of slow. Sanderson does move at a very slow pace in all of his books. And so I think that some of these books are in this series are the fastest he has. I think Warbreaker is also pretty fast, but the Mistborn Trilogy is my favorite of those few, and I would definitely recommend it. It's a bit slow, but it's worth it in my opinion. And if you really don't mind slow, then I have to recommend you The Way of Kings, which is 1,000 pages. Every book in this series is over 1,000 pages. This is going to be a 10-book series, only 4 are out currently, and it's amazing. I love the series so much. As you all know, it's my favorite series. And these are some of my favorite books ever. And they're all 1,000 pages. They're all very large. They all can be slow at times, but the character work is just so interesting that it kept me going through all of these books. And the plot, I think, is also very interesting. So I just had a great time reading the Stormlight books, and they're all very thick. I would recommend all of them. Sanderson's my favorite author. This is my favorite series by him. If you haven't picked up these beasts yet, then you should. Now I'm going to get into some other genres. I have some non-fantasy books, and then I'm just going to wrap it up with one other fantasy book that's a little bit less popular than those last few on BookTube. So the first non-fantasy book I'm going to mention is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. This is a historical fiction about Nazi-occupied France, and you follow 2 sisters who live in France during this Nazi occupation, and the small ways or the hidden ways that they resist and that they show their strength and find ways to try to protect themselves and the people around them. I love this book. It's over 500 pages. It is a very devastating book. I'll put trigger warnings for all of these books, but this one, Sword of Kaigen, definitely need it. This was such a good story and I loved reading it, so I definitely recommend it. It's slow in the way that historical fiction is slow, but it was so readable that I didn't find it feeling slow or draggy at all. The next book is a speculative fiction book, and that is It by Stephen King. This is horror. Stephen King, I have my issues with him as an author, but I still wanted to recommend this because it is probably one of the largest books I've read other than Stormlight. And this is a horror about a clown that is terrorizing a town, and these kids have to defeat him when they're young, and then they have to come back years later as adults and defeat him again. And so we have a dual timeline, but it's so much more than just a clown killer, guys. It's really so much more. This is a very character-driven horror, but even so, I was thrilled on every page. I thought the action of this book, while it wasn't a super high action book all the time, it always felt high stakes and eerie and creepy enough to keep me on the edge of my seat. It was a very suspenseful book, and it was suspenseful from page 1 to page 1000 and something when this book ends. I really enjoyed this book, and I think it's a really great, long, yet thrilling horror. And the final big book recommendation I'm going to leave you with is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So this is a fantasy that is an alternate history of the Napoleonic Wars. And so we're following the Napoleonic Wars, but if some magicians existed and had magic. And so we don't just follow the wars, but a lot of what we follow with this plot is about the wars. But the heart of this book is really the relationship between 2 magicians, Mr. Norrell and Jonathan Strange. They have a very complex relationship, and they can be kind of on and off. There's a lot of magic in this book that is subtle and hidden at first, and then slowly sort of makes its way into the forefront of this world. It takes a lot from English folklore and Welsh folklore, I think. And the magic of this book was just so beautiful. The plot was very slow and had a lot of things bogging it down, in my opinion. The footnotes could bog it down a little bit, even though they provide extra interesting world building. And it had some slow parts, but for the most part, this was a vivid and interesting novel with a beautiful, quirky writing style that could sometimes make fun of its own characters and situations, and brilliantly constructed characters that you truly feel who they are and their relationships with one another. I think my copy of this was 800 pages, but a lot of copies of this book are over 1,000. This was the first book that I ever read that was so long. It was my first ever big book that I read on this list, I'm pretty sure. And I still like to recommend it because I still love it and miss that book. And I don't know how much I'll be able to reread it in my life because it does have parts that lag, but it has so much good in it that I think it absolutely deserves all the critical acclaim that it has gotten, and I think it deserves a little bit more on BookTube. So I just wanted to recommend that in case you haven't read it yet. You can talk to me about any of these books in the comments. Let me know your favorite big books down in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Bye!